So I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome today Stefanie Syman to Keen on Yoga, and her book is The Subtle Body, The Story of Yoga in America. Did I get that right, the title this time?
You got it right. Yes.
Excellent,
Yes.
excellent. So thanks, Stephanie, for coming on. I've really enjoyed your book, and it's just a pleasure to actually speak to you in the flesh. Well, semi in the flesh. Oh,
Thank you. Yeah. It was very much a labor of love. And so I enjoyed writing the book. And it's interesting to reflect on it now, too, because it came out some time ago. And things have continued to evolve, certainly in the States and I imagine elsewhere. And, when
13
you and I
years,
start,
right?
it's 13 years, yes.
Right, yeah.
And so when you and I started chatting, one thing we sort of quickly recognized was that yoga is so kind of assimilated and just part of the atmosphere and part of many people's day-to-day lives. It's no longer almost worthy of note. Whereas even when I began, certainly when I began writing the book, and even when I concluded writing the book, it was still, there would still be developments that would kind of bubble up into collective consciousness that were controversial or interesting or weird. Whereas now we really take it for granted as part of certainly American culture.
Mm,
And so it's just interesting how it's, there are no news articles anymore. It's just like
mm.
it's there, it's available. There are many types. Um, Most adults that one comes across, certainly in the big cities of America, have tried it, whether or not they've actually enjoyed it or pursued it.
Mm.
So it's a really different moment here, which makes it interesting to sort of go back into the history because I think we do forget how long it took to achieve this status as just another American pastime in this sort of almost boring way.
Mm. But you also mentioned in the book that it had those stages of evolution. I mean, especially around, when would you say that the asana starts to kick in? Around kind of 1920s, 30s with Theos Bernard?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely evidence that even in the earlier, even when Vivekananda was here, so at the in the late 19th century, that people were being taught asana. Like there was a
I
New
thought he
York
famously
Herald.
hated asana, didn't he?
He
Yeah.
publicly hated it, but other
Yeah.
teachers who kind of came with him or
Right.
came, because of the interest he started to generate, were definitely teaching asana. And there was, I remember this New York Herald piece in 1898, and it had the headline was something like the society ladies are doing this crazy thing called yoga, and it had illustrations of people doing the poses and talked about the poses, and it was quite scandalous at the time, partly because there was still so much racism too, so it was white ladies and Indian men that was problematic, but it was also just kind of wasn't mean spirited. It was a little bit light-hearted and just kind of titillating. And so the asanas were being taught really in the 19th century. Now they start to really become more available, um, in the early 20th century. A character
Mm.
like Pierre Bernard, he's teaching the upper echelons, very wealthy people, and he's absolutely teaching hatha yoga. I mean, and
Mm.
a tantra, his kind of rendition of it. And then his nephew Theos kind of continues to bring that to America. And by the time you're in the 40s, you start to get people like Indra Devi, who has a more kind of a softer, more mass market appeal in the way she presents yoga. And partly it's where she is for some period of career. She's in Hollywood. So she starts to attract not just wealthy kind of society ladies, but movie stars, and so she really is one of these forebears of what we experience as yoga today, which is it's for health, it's for healing, it's for healthy digestion, it's for toned limbs. And her book and record and teaching, she kind of branded under this forever young, forever healthy, I believe is the title. And
Mm.
so she
Mm.
was really early in seeing that Americans were really open to yoga, the hatha yoga, if as long as you didn't go stray too deeply into the sort of spiritual, into the metaphysics and the what to Americans were more the stranger dimensions of the transformation in consciousness possible through yoga. You know, Indra Devi was not talking about raising your kundalini or opening your third eye, at least in her outward facing presentation. So you get this kind of steady progression, I think, in terms of making it accessible and making the asana practice accessible to Americans.
Well, the Vivekananda and the Indra Devi are probably public facing, kind of like going to the people, but I mean on their own. On their own terms, I mean, we know that Indra Devi was taught by Krishnamacharya and you know had a
Yes,
kind of strong
yes,
spiritual practice that I think she just chose not to
absolutely.
share or divulge to to the public.
Absolutely. They often
Mm,
had
mm,
a kind of exoteric presentation that once you were even close to them, I think Vivekananda in his speeches and, he's at the World's Fair, that presentation was very agreeable and softened in some ways.
mm,
Whereas, he was absolutely, even though he famously did not want to teach the asana practice, he was definitely talking about moving the energy through the subtle body and using sexual energy for spiritual enlightenment in his teachings in small groups in New England. So it's
mm,
not that he was um, completely not whitewashing, completely taking all of the sort of controversial parts out of yoga. It's like the setting he was in. And yes, he was concerned about teaching asana to Americans because he was concerned about, in some ways, what did come to pass. That it would be kind of broken off from the body of the teachings and taken for something else, and that also it was a little bit betray for Americans at the time.
mm, mm. I suppose it's easy to kind of blame the West for it, isn't it? But I mean, the movement of modernizing asana comes, well, we know with Krishnamacharya, who modernized it and used yoga as a
Yes,
therapy,
yes,
right? And he was a classical
yes,
Brahmin guy, like so he did something really different. He also taught women, obviously he had to be
yes,
pressed first of all to teach Indra Devi. He wasn't planning on doing that, but I think
yes,
there's some pressure was exerted upon him, and he did.
yeah. She
But
was
nevertheless, he
determined.
took,
Yeah,
yes. Well, she was kind of highly connected as well, wasn't she? But
yes,
um, but he also kind of mentions in books that about teaching women, and he allows foreigners to chant. In the end, he's kind of happy for them to chant, even if they don't know the exact meter, etc. And Vivekananda also kind of broke off and says, he say something like, I'm using my brain in service of my people, right? He comes over and he basically wants to generate money to bring back to India, right? So he has a humanistic
yes.
concern and a background of more humanistic concerns than, say, maybe classical Vedanta would suggest towards life. That he's
Yeah,
looking towards
and
life now. He's looking towards yoga serving life rather than yoga serving spiritual
the
oneness
transcendence.
with God. Yes, or
Yes,
transcendence, exactly.
yes. I mean, I think I'm not sure that they saw a contradiction in those things, but yes, I mean,
Right.
certainly in the
Mm-mm.
presentation. Um, but what you're pointing to is true, that like yoga became something that was easy to incorporate into being successful in this world, and 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 I think in Vivekananda's case and Krishnamacharya's, there was a greater mission to their country and to the revival of yoga in India, or the revival is probably not quite the right word, but the sort of restoring its reputation. I haven't studied that
Mm.
deeply, but it certainly seems to have been a casualty of colonialism to some extent. And so their efforts really were a reclamation of their history and the history of the tradition. But certainly in the US, I think for Americans to feel that it was something they could participate in, they were, since they did not inherit a lot of the concepts of Hinduism, um, they had to kind of be sold on being helped now. So even someone like Yogananda in the 20s, he was extremely good at marketing yoga, like help you be thinner, help you make money. Like it was really like, this is not about departing from or transcending your current daily life or leaving your family and giving away your possessions and becoming some sort of, wandering ascetic. It's like yoga will help you now with the problems you have, whether that's your career, your marriage, your health. And that strain of marketing yoga as a almost a cure-all for worldly problems is very consistent through the history of yoga in America.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and it's interesting how, and so it's interesting to reflect on where yoga has landed, but that is absolutely um, right. And Vivekananda was keenly aware of this as well, although I think someone like Yogananda went even further in that direction, who was in the
I mean, it
early
kind of,
20s, who came here in the early 20s.
yeah, yeah. I mean, paradoxically, though, there's still this kind of taint of exotification or kind of, um, is esotericism, like in as much as Yogananda writes his book, which is, I mean, it's kind of the claims are spectacular, let's say, in the book, right? You don't think of
Right.
the same guy placing ads, in the papers and getting this whole organization around him before he travels to the next gig to make sure
Yes.
that people have, bums are on seats, right? You don't, so there is this
Yes.
kind of presentation, an outward facing guru, which I think you point to in the book, is that,
Yes.
when it comes to the US, just not so much in the UK, I think, but I think you say that the Swamis did and came to the UK, but definitely it's a guru. There's still this taking on of the guru persona in the UK, I think, until fairly recently, right? That they're buying into the kind of magic of the guru, um, and yet on a very pragmatic schemata as well. As much as we mentioned in the talk we had before that uh, Vivekananda says, go into your own room and get the Upanishads out of yourself, or he's really giving the mantle to the individual to do what they want with it,
Yes.
which is a super new thing as well, because as we know, even in India today, like you don't just you don't just
Yeah.
kind of like interpret the teachings how you fancy, right? Like you read the commentaries, you study and you learn to chant it. Like it's
Yeah.
not your opinion that matters, right?
Yes. I mean, I think that in terms of Yogananda and how esoteric that book was, that book came out 20 years or a little bit more after he arrived here. I believe it came out in 1946, but certainly,
Interesting.
but maybe even later, if I recall. I
Mm.
mean, certainly it wasn't, it maybe he completed the manuscript then.
Mm.
So it was, I think around then that the book came out. It was not when he first came. And in some
Hmm.
ways, I don't think he could have published it when he first came because it was so out there. What he recounts is like not, beyond most Americans' comprehension. I think those stories of miracles might have been more familiar to Indians, of like just like, oh yeah, I've heard that this kind of a story before. Maybe it's in a scripture, but it's not. There's not only one guy who can do that, which in Christianity is Jesus, right? Like, like I think in Hinduism, there's just more possibility for that. So, but Yogananda, that book, he really built his following here before that book came out, and I don't know that that book really was taken up as fervently until like the 60s. I think that book really saw a strong, uh, sales. I'm not recalling the data, but it felt like the book met its time quite a bit after he even passed away.
Mm. 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 Mm.
Um,
I.
so yeah, I
Mm.
mean, there's always this kind of tension between, right, like yoga helping you in this life now, and this sort of longing for a mystical, magical experience
Mm.
that yoga somehow supports.
Mm. I think what you also point out too is that we assume that the trajectory is one way only, but when you look at, I mean, I wanted you to talk a little bit about the what I suggested were maybe the context of the modern roots of yoga, the transcendental and transcendentalist movement
Yes,
in the US. Emerson and Thoreau, and when Thoreau says, like even even sometimes I am a yogi, when he's at Walden
yes,
Pond, right? But but there's a very practical take at that point though, when he's reading the Gita and he's writing these books and he's kind of going into town and he's having a little bit of wine or like it, and he says, oh, I practice it a couple of weeks when sometimes when I can get the energy up, right? Like
yeah, yeah,
it's a quite a kind of in the spirit of kind of the modern American and the kind of individuation and and self autonomy. I think it's grasped in a different mantle than it later is when as you point out, in the 60s, when it all becomes rather mystical and about the guru. But
yes.
it kind of goes in a kind of circle in a way,
Yes.
you know.
Yeah, I think there's kind of sort of spirals. I think you're absolutely
Mm,
right.
mm,
And there are
mm,
these, you could also think of it as kind of as dialectic. So I think the thing with Thoreau, I think you rightly point out, it's like his interpretation, it's kind of woven into his life. And he was never just in the cabin. He was always actually rather social. Like this notion that he was out in the
yeah,
cabin and
yeah,
didn't see anyone for months and months and months was always a bit of a myth or mistake in a conception of what actually happened there. But but there were actually no gurus here then. So like he had no choice but to make his own sense of those scriptures, and he didn't have the opportunity of sitting with a Neem Karoli Baba who never came here, but even a Muktananda who came here in the early 70s and have that experience of being around a different kind of energy where many students recounted this feeling of being being in his presence and maybe exchanging a couple words with Muktananda actually transformed their consciousness. Like that was just not available to Thoreau. So I think the depth of mysticism that was available to him or depth of connection was just somewhat limited by circumstance. But he
Mm.
certainly was interested in that dimension of it. He was not looking at yoga so he could be a better office worker or be calmer on his daily commute. You know, he was looking to plumb the secrets of the universe and of his, consciousness as he understood it at the time, as were all the transcendentalists. And,
Mm.
Emerson's transparent eyeball, I think of often when you look at like Advaita Vedanta and this sort of understanding of being pure awareness, this witnessing stance. So I do think the Transcendentalists managed to experience these states of consciousness that yoga devs promise and offer when you practice either diligently or with a guru, but they just had to kind of do it on their own. Um,
Mm.
and then you see that kind of real turn towards a more practical application, but that doesn't really happen until we get kind of into the 20th century, early 20th century, and the swamis, as we said, coming and having to find a way to convince Americans that this was something that could benefit them, even though it was heretical, being taught by men who looked very different than the people in power, and that's when I think you start to get the focus on the kind of practical integration, at least outwardly facing, to at least attract people to hear more.
Mm. Mm.
And and so it goes, and then those cycles go on from there.
Mm. I kind of feel like, having talked to you before and suggested that yoga was much more practically taken in the UK, I think the mystical thing crept in a lot earlier in the UK with the Theosophical Society, and Paul Brunton goes to India, right?
Yeah.
And he meets Ramana Maharishi, and he writes the secret, I can't remember, Secret Journey of India or something like that in a book.
Well, yeah. Well, you also had a different relation to India. I think it had,
Mm.
because of colonialism, I think India probably held or contained in the imagination already this exotic land,
Mm.
where people were going there in
Mm.
real numbers and then coming back.
Yeah.
And there was probably more storytelling around the mysteries of India, where in America,
You just didn't
you
have
know,
exposure to it. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
as much, not
Mm.
nearly as
Mm. Mm.
much,
Mm.
or
Mm.
only through the literature that was coming out of the
Mm.
UK, right? So, and we were still building the country. I mean, we're still like, pushing out the indigenous peoples and settling the West. So I think that puts a different spin on in our encounter with it.
So after the kind of Pierre Bernard and Theo Bernard, and the omnipotent Om, and this kind of thing, that that kind of happens around the 40s, maybe into the 50s, does it? You wrote a excellent chapter in the book on the 60s and what happens to yoga in the 60s. Do you want to just unfold that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think, so by the time you get to the 60s, I think what people don't realize is you already have two very strong strains of yoga, or presentations rather, of yoga. And one is this more practical presentation of hatha yoga. And you have people like Richard Hittleman, kind of building on Indra Devi's legacy, and others who are like, the asanas are good for health, they're good for back pain. You can come into a studio near Grand Central Station in New York City and just, do your class, and there's showers and saunas. And so that very kind of unassuming, almost bland presentation of yoga. And now, even though Richard Hittleman himself had a deep spiritual connection to yoga, he understood that if he was going to attract housewives and office workers, he was going to kind of play that mystical dimension down. At the same moment, you have, you know, certainly by the late 60s. And so, but even sort of starting in the mid 60s, the mystical strains start kind of returning. So, and there are a couple reasons for this. One is people start going to India. So the boomers are now coming of age. They're curious. Someone like Allen Ginsberg in 62, he goes to India. And there he's coming back recounting his experience. And he had a kind of ambivalent experience, but certainly was deeply moved by it. Um, and the laws changed. By 1965, the laws changed, the immigration laws changed in the US. So it's now easier to come and stay if you are an Indian Swami or Guru. And so, um, and then finally, and we'll go back to that in a second, there's a third dimension, which is people, the kind of preceding generation, so like of seekers, and this includes people like Aldous Huxley, who was living here, and someone like Alan Watts, also Brit, but living here. They have been kind of delving into Eastern religion, talking about it, often not just yoga, but Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, and you had the beats. So there was this kind of definite interest in the spiritual dimension of the spiritual possibilities of a variety of Eastern traditions, including yoga. And then those guys start doing psychedelics. And they're like, aha, all those things that we've been reading about or kind of intimating, you do a dose of mescaline or a dose of acid, like it cleanses the doors of perception. I have it's like I experienced Satchidananda. Like I get it now. That's exactly what Huxley said in The Doors of Perception, which came out in the 50s. And he really saw this religious revolution brought about by psychedelics because he's like, oh, you've got God in a pill. It's right there. You don't have to do this long, winding path. It's just right there. So you start those, while it was early for the psychedelic revolution, those were strains that were starting to be present. Um, and actually, acid becomes kind of relatively available in the early 60s in New York. It takes a little longer to hit the West Coast. So you start to have people experiencing these very different and altered states of consciousness that are extremely powerful. And so while the Beat generation and those kind of the Huxleys and the Alan Watts and kind of their uh, compatriots, they kind of studied Eastern mysticism and then did psychedelics. So they had that framework for it. By the kind of early mid 60s, it starts to reverse. And so you have kids that are doing psychedelics and having these very powerful transformative experiences. And then you start having the swamis come. And so those things are kind of happening almost at the same time. And you also have figures like Leary and Ram Dass, who are, psychonauts, who are really proselytizers for psychedelics and using yoga imagery and text and using Tibetan Buddhist imagery and text to kind of couch their psychedelic experiences. So these things are like kind of mixed up. But by the time the Swamis start coming in real numbers in the mid and later 60s, they really are starting to say, hey, look, guys, you can have those really powerful transformative experiences without the drugs. And you also and just to go back to like the kind of avatars of this possibility, you had the Beatles doing this, like they kind of encapsulated that very experience, right? They were doing some acid, they were having these experiences, but George was really into TM, transcendental meditation, and
Yeah,
studying with Maharishi Mahesh. And
I
then
don't think they could say it at the time, could they? I think there was maybe more honesty with the psychedelics in the US, but I think with the Beatles, they kind of couched it in kind of symbolic
yeah,
language, didn't they?
yes,
They
they
could never
were,
really say it in the mainstream, like, oh, we're guys, we're taking drugs, and
yeah,
Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, isn't about. I don't know what they said it was about, something silly like getting on a bus or something and seeing a girl in the bus. I think it was something like silly like that,
right, exactly.
But
But
yeah,
they
it was funny that they
absolutely
didn't. Yeah,
they
all
were
right.
circumspect about it, but they did have a similar trajectory of like using psychedelics and then having an experience with meditation, particularly George, that led them to go to Rishikesh and study with Maharishi Mahesh, which is to say, it began to be reported on extensively, and celebrities were now getting involved with gurus. And so it now became much more of a possibility, both in the imagination of young Americans and in their reality, because the gurus started really arriving. And that's that's this moment where it's very much about mysticism. It's very much about experiencing something that's very different from your daily life, and life as laid out for you by post-war mores and norms. You're like, you're gonna go to college, get a job, and be part of the, corporate machinery.
And again, the spiral has come, it's kind of come a full circle or a full spiral, as it were, because what you point out again is coming true now is that psychedelics are becoming popular, very recently now, right? And then this is the hot topic now. Whereas even a few years ago, when we were talking of our starting yoga, and I know that
Uh-huh.
Stefanie did Ashtanga as well for a while, and maybe still does. We haven't talked about that, but it really wasn't the thing, and I maybe backpedal slightly and talk about how the kind of Western psychoanalysis took hold of yoga, because that was really the strain that kind of divides the two, right? Because when you talk about psychedelics, we're talking about God consciousness, but when we talk about kind of like Western psychology, it's something much more pragmatic, like
Yes.
integration of past experiences or
Yes.
resolution of traumas, and this is kind of going on in tandem with something else, and it kind of toggles between one and the
Yes.
other, doesn't it?
Yes. And so back to the 60s and then into the 70s, you had this great interest in yoga and people going and living in ashrams and following gurus. Um, Psychedelics kind of peaked in the late 60s, and then they were outlawed. So to do psychedelics in the US was to break, they became Schedule A, I believe, which is like, you're really breaking the law. This is not like a small problem. This is like a big deal. And so it was then they had to go underground. Um, and so kind of at the same time, the gurus started, but as you kind of move into the 70s, the gurus start to lose their luster. And certainly by the late 70s, you have a lot of the surfacing of a lot of bad behavior by the gurus. So they really come off looking like these almost authoritarian abusers of power. And the sort of mystique of the guru is kind of within a half decade pretty much eviscerated by all of the bad
Really?
news. Yeah. And almost every single one became the subject of allegations by more than one person, and then cover ups within the organization. And so, even if you could say that Muktananda did these amazing things and inspired so many people, it was hard to defend him at a certain point. And that was true of almost every single guru who came to the US. At the same time, I do think yoga was being incorporated and seen as something purely therapeutic, both on the physical side and on in the psychological dimension. And so you see, for instance, the founding of Yoga Journal magazine in the 70s, and their presentation was this very worldly, therapeutic, both mentally and physically kind of yoga. And this sort of both the therapeutic version of yoga kind of won by the end of the 70s, and that the kind of uh, dismissal or kind of the pushing away of the God consciousness, that it just became unfashionable to talk about yoga as a path to see God. Isherwood did a translation of
Yeah, I was just
the
thinking
Pancha,
Ishward. Yeah,
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 yeah, his
yeah,
the
yeah.
in the 40s of the Yoga Sutras, and it's like the title of the book is How to Know God. That book, like in the late 70s into the 80s, that just it's not that those books weren't available. It was just not how yoga was being talked about, how people were really in general relating to it on a cultural level. Now, there are always individuals who are finding yoga and finding this very mystical, spiritual version of yoga, but in terms of what the culture was able to metabolize and what was being, the schools that were thriving, they were Hatha Yoga schools inspired by Iyengar, which really denuded yoga of this sort of more overt religiosity and spirituality. And it was about the asana practice. You weren't chanting, you weren't even meditating so much. It was really that grounded. And then again, as people were talking about it, it was very much seen in psychological terms. It was not about transcending and having this such a different experience of subjectivity that you almost don't have the words for it. It was about, being calm in the face of stress,
Mm,
about,
mm.
those sorts of things.
Well, also when people kind of say, well, now, oh, yoga is union. And if you were to question someone more, so what does this union mean? They would say, well, it's self-knowledge, isn't it? It's self-knowledge. And it's like, well, that's such a common parlance. But actually, it wasn't really self-knowledge, was it? It was God knowledge. Yoga was there for the
Yes,
knowledge of God. It
absolutely.
wasn't really
Yeah.
there for the knowledge of self as an individual with a fragile ego that needed to be kind of integrated, right? So, I mean, I think and that's such a
Yes.
it's so close to one's nose that it's hard to see out of that now, where we feel like we're doing yoga for being a you ask anyone these are being a better person, being like more centered, being like
Yes.
more aware. More awareness is
Yes.
that being aware is the kind of the sine qua non now of of what you need that for. I don't know if you're not looking for God, but apparently to be very aware of yourself.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think I kind of trace that transformation from when it was moving from God knowledge to sort of personal individual self-knowledge as the kind of going from a capital S self-knowledge, which was
Mm,
how many Indian, promulgators of yoga translated God knowledge itself, but the self was the transcendental self, and goes to a little s, right? A not capitalized self knowledge. And that happens like in the late 70s in the US. And that is what kind of where we kind of landed, and what became the yoga that has been more fully assimilated here, which is, again, not to say you cannot find other versions and and go to the more complete understanding of yoga with specific teachers. But when you're going to take a yoga class in the US at this point, it is all about that small s, not about the big S, more
mm.
often than not. And we had to go through another turn of the wheel. And this time it was less about the remystification of yoga, and it was more about presenting it as a more demanding, like we were still wanting something from the practice that the fully softened version of Hatha Yoga taught in the 70s at the Y, or even the early 80s at the Y in the US, didn't satisfy, which is to say, when you had Patabi Joyce and Bikram present their versions of yoga, Ashtanga and Bikram yoga, I think I think Americans kind of were welcomed those practices and those teachings because they were more demanding. And even if they weren't demanding in terms of I'm on a spiritual path and I'm going to meditate at 4 in the morning and I'm going to chant for 2 hours a day and then maybe I'll do a little asana and then I'll read scripture, there was still something quite demanding about the physical practice that felt somewhat salvific and a little bit more both consonant with fitness culture at the time, but also I think it did feel like maybe an alternative path to,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
just
It's
going
another turn of the
down
wheel.
the.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're
So
just
it was
doing
less
a little bit of
mystical,
yoga,
but there
as
was
you say.
something
Like,
about
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
there's
yeah.
something about
But you
having to
also did.
commit to it that I think was part of the appeal.
I think it's like it's another turn of that wheel, isn't it? Because you don't have to any longer go. I mean, you document in a great. I can't remember which chapter it is, but they're all going. They're going to do the psychedelics, and they live in an ashram together, and then half of the gang like split off to a different kind of ashram where they're not doing the psychedelics,
Oh,
or
yes.
right, like and right, yeah, yeah,
Yes.
and you kind of get this feeling and also your Theos Bernard, he kind of has a commune around him, and I think you mentioned a number of times in the book
Yeah.
that
Yes.
it has to be this all encompassing kind of
Yes.
lifestyle where you're in it or you're not, and
Yes.
then the 80s come and it's like, well, that all didn't work, and everyone just kind of packs up the bag, and Iyengar's still teaching, obviously, and
Yeah.
he's teaching under the auspices of physical education, and these postures do this for the health, and it's and then it comes the 90s come, and it's almost like that gets one gets cynical about that, right? And
Yes.
some they want a
Yes.
bit more again, but they want a bit more in a way that they're not going to go to an ashram anymore, but they're going to kind of take it in the everyday life,
Yes.
kind of incorporate it in a kind of in a different manner again. Yeah.
Yeah, so absolutely. And the house was Millbrook, and that was in upstate New
Yes.
York. And
Well,
it
yeah.
was
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, Peggy Hitchcock was this wealthy woman who hosted basically Timothy Leary and his minions, and Ram Dass was there for a while, and uh, Metzger, there, the third of the trio, and they were blending, but it was really Leary show, and they were blending psychedelics and Eastern mysticism, a lot of yoga. And then it's true, there were some refugees from Ananda ashram that came and lived there. But the point you're making, which is absolutely true, and did not just hold with Millbrook, but was at ashrams around the country, was you were dedicating your entire life. You were shedding all outward appearances of being an ordinary American to the point where parents got really worried and would go kidnap their kids and deprogram them because they were involved in these horrible yoga cults. And so, you know, I think in many cases the kids really felt harmed by the kidnapping because they had chosen this very complete and very different lifestyle. They had chosen happily to live in at a place where you woke up at four enchanted and lived communally. But because of those allegations and because of the kind of the dark clouds that came around so many of the gurus, we really rejected that wholesale. And then we're not satisfied with the very um, kind of softened version, what's called marshmallow yoga, and you hear people referring to it that way. Like it's just there's not much to it, but we didn't want to go all the way back to that. You have to let go of everything, and all you really leave your job. We wanted some way of experiencing a deeper commitment, but not to the levels of the 60s and early 70s. And so I do think Ashtanga and Bikram really you couldn't just show up once a week. You couldn't just show up even maybe twice a week and you really had to commit to doing
Yeah,
that practice fit really
and the
consistently to survive it,
and the
right?
early
And then
morning,
there's
yeah,
something
the early
that
morning
felt
nature,
right
yeah,
about it for the
yeah,
moment.
yeah, the heat, the early
Absolutely.
morning,
With
the
Ashtanga, getting
striving,
up.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah, the ritual
Yeah.
around the
And so it was
repetition.
in some way. Yes, I think the ritual was and the consistency of the container in both cases, right? So you could go anywhere in the country to an Ashtanga studio or to Bikram studio, and you got exactly the same thing, and you knew exactly what you were getting. Yes, teachers they may had slight differences in presentation, but they were very minor. And I do think that the communities that arose around these types of yoga were very strong. Um, which we were also craving. But again, it wasn't like having to pack up and move to upstate New York. It was you were able to have a job. I'm not so sure you were able to have kids and a job, but you could have kids or a job. You could probably have one or the other and still participate in a very consistent way um, uh, with this type of yoga. Um, yeah,
Well, yeah, I mean, what you drew attention to in the book also was that kind of fallow period in the 80s. And I hesitate to find anyone who pops up in my mind apart from BKS Iyengar, who kind of bridges that gap, or in a consistent way through the 70s to the 80s. And you think of any other figures that were around in the 80s? Because there was a lull. I mean, we talked before we started this interview about how we when we got into it, it
yeah,
was still
yeah.
fairly unknown. And I would talk, and I'm sure many people that are listening, if they'd started in the 90s, they would say they were doing yoga, and someone, as I mentioned, they would do the Padmasana position and say Om and put their hands in yoga mudra, you know, and you'd say
Yes.
no, 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 like I'm doing something a bit more dynamic, like it's moving, like it's like kind of gymnastic here, talking about Ashtanga, and there was still that idea of it back at that time. So it's kind of fallen down or changed, because when you talk about Theos Bernard, for example, I didn't realize he also has that girlfriend, or that kind of the outward facing presentation of his yoga system, right? And I can't remember her name. They're very dynamic systems of
Oh,
gymnastics, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yes,
What's her
yes.
name? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Theos was, I mean, Pierre Bernard had Blanche de Vries. So Pierre
Ah,
had
Blanche
a
de Vie. Sorry,
very
sorry. I think
able
yeah, yeah,
teacher
yeah,
of the
yeah.
asana. Yeah, that was Pierre Bernard, who's
That
on the
that's who
Theos
I'm
asana
that's who
side.
I'm thinking of. Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, so yeah, and she ended up teaching Christopher Isherwood out in Hollywood. So, and she was very she was a dancer by training, so she brought all of that kind of athleticism and grace and agility to it. But I think what you're pointing to is that, that on the one hand, yoga was still present here, but it was really not part of the cultural conversation. And it was present in the form of Iyengar, mostly, which you had mentioned before.
Mm.
Bikram was definitely building, but again, he wasn't quite, he was starting to get some attention. It kind of went up and down a bit. And Badawi Joy started making trips to the US too and starting to slowly build a following. But the kind of real energy around yoga, it took till I think the 90s to really gather enough um, kind of heat and light, and the celebrities that were practicing either Bikram or Ashtanga to really bring it back to the fore. And for, I think, Gen X in the US to kind of reclaim it. And the way we reclaimed it really did have to do initially with, oh, yeah, yoga can whip my ass as much as aerobics or running, or, like we were saying, like it is now equally physically demanding as these other types of movement and exercise. So it was not saying, oh, this is a path to know God. It was more like, it's okay. I mean, if you think about culturally what's going on in the US, we had just come out of Reagan years, AIDS crisis. So we were not a hopeful or an idealistic country. We were a kind of like somewhat potentially cynical and pessimistic country, the rise of the Christian right. So yoga was not our kind of spiritual salvation at first. I think many people began yoga because they kind of got curious, and because it's like, oh, maybe there is a way of practicing yoga that feels satisfying physically. Now, I do think many, many people may have started with this curiosity in the physical practice and then understood and began to become more invested in yoga as a spiritual technology. And it's kind of almost like a Trojan horse, right? And I think that was always true, that the asana practice was put forward, and some number of people start to go down the rabbit hole and land right where one would hope, right? Seeing and understanding the completeness of yoga and all its possibilities. But I think in the resurgence really in the 90s in the US came about because you had these very demanding practices that had this very ritualistic quality that could shed some of that ladies, middle-aged ladies at the Y uh, baggage, cultural baggage. Now you see yoga
Yeah.
at the Y, and I'm a middle-aged lady, and it's at the Y, it's at Equinox, but it's also at Eddie's Broome Street Yoga Temple and Ganesha Temple and many other such places.
Yeah, I think it's called Broome Street again. It's had different incarnations, isn't it? Was it called Ganesha and now it's Broome Street? But I think Eddie is a good case, a point example, really, in doing a number of things, right? Like in a demanding practice and bringing the kind of, the religious aspect to it. And now we talked a little bit before how Eddie's now doing the therapeutics. He's putting it to modern science. And we see that, from Vivekananda, this wish to ally yoga to modern scientific
Yeah.
understanding. But on the other hand, there's also this kind of crazy yoga for good booty, and and more like it's kind of like vinyasa
Oh yeah.
for XYZ, or like yoga box. I've seen anything.
Yeah.
The yoga chocolate in the beer is even more crazy than yoga goat. I think um, um,
Oh yeah.
you know
Yoga and
where,
wine.
yeah,
Yeah. Yoga,
yeah,
yoga and
yeah,
cannabis. Yeah.
yeah. It was crazy, isn't it? I don't
Yeah.
know. It's
So
an open-ended question, really. Where do you
so
think we're going now with it? Yeah.
so I mean, I think that we no longer have nearly as much pressure to convince people that yoga is something that you benefit from. And which is to say, I think most Americans, if asked, they'd either have like whatever yoga, like they'd either have no strong opinion, or they'd be like, yeah, yoga's probably good for me. I don't do it. And then, of course, you have those who are practice consistently. Um, Look, anything that becomes really popular, you're going to get all sorts of kooky permutations. Like God bless the people who do yoga and wine. I'm not much interest myself, but I think it's kind of silly. But someone might do that, and with all of these things, it may be the way they do encounter yoga, and they do start to get curious and begin to understand its possibilities. I do think as you mentioned, this wish to explain yoga in scientific terms has been with us even since the early 20th century. Um, when it became clear that like Americans really that language was very convincing to Americans. And really, since the early 20th century, the technology to be able to understand the impact of yoga has evolved so dramatically. So, whereas people would sort of make these claims about yoga's effects, we now actually have a scientific vocabulary and the actual technology to back up those claims. I find it personally um, less appealing. Like I think it's interesting that we feel such a strong need to kind of justify yoga in scientific terms. However, it's kind of interesting to note that our instruments can now measure the impact of pranayama on the vagus nerve. And so for some people, I think they really need
Allegedly.
to feel like the assurance of
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
assurance of like, oh right, this is clinically working versus their subjective experience of like, I feel a lot better after yoga class. And I can subjectively experience the power. So I do think, to your point, Eddie's really explored all dimensions, and I think he's been
Mm.
very dedicated to helping people understand the depth of yoga. And science is one way of making it comprehensible and legible to Americans. That's been very
Yeah,
powerful for
yeah.
the
And
last,
as you say,
100
yeah.
years.
I mean, not only Kavalinanda in Kavalidan, but also, I mean, Vivekananda comes over and starts talking about Brahman in terms of ether, doesn't he? I forgot that, he really tries
Yeah.
to kind of
Yes.
put a kind of a scientific spin on it, so that's, it's from the get go, really, that,
From
trying.
the, yeah,
But
yeah, really before the 20th century. Yeah.
do you think that somehow, due to the kind of wish to, I don't know how to say it, so objectivize one's experience, the kind of subjective pioneering now being so much lesser, there's something is perhaps shifted or in for the worse in terms of one's own trajectory with yoga, perhaps,
Yeah.
in term, yeah, you don't have to stick your head above the
So
the
I don't,
parapet anymore, to, yeah.
yes. So that's an interesting point because I think that right now, certainly in the US, a lot of the energy around exploring these states of consciousness, that God consciousness, are kind of located in psychedelics. And yoga is kind of more assimilated and more for like functioning well. Again, I don't think that's for everyone, but I do think in terms of from the cultural perspective, the conversation around psychedelics is like it's very much like on the one hand they enable these mystical experiences, on the other hand let's get legalization, and the path to legalization is to prove scientifically the therapeutic value of psychedelics. So you actually see the same dynamic of like, is it for God consciousness or is it for healing depression? And that the path
Interesting.
to mass acceptance is to insist upon the therapeutic value. Now, what's interesting about psychedelics, though, is there are now even studies that show it is the very mystical experience that delivers the therapeutic value. And
Yeah. And why
that's
is
a
it the
whole other
polarity that has
conversation,
to?
and I'm not an
Yeah,
expert, but
it's true that you've got the
right,
polarity that's
right,
always been there, but it's
because
like, well, Jung. I mean, I was reading Jung today, and he has the. Did you hear the Oxford group? He had a group at a certain point that was for. It was like kind of like a forerunner of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was basically based on having a religious experience.
uh-huh,
That if you didn't, that they would cure alcoholism
yes,
for many people through.
yes,
They had to have a religious experience, otherwise they would never be cured. And that's Jung saying that. So that's the two things going together, isn't it? Like modern, like life
yeah,
and living an okay life and not being alcoholic, and also
yes,
living up here. But there seems to be this kind of binary kind of schism, which is still equating
yes.
now, as you mentioned today.
Yes, and I think it's partly because, well, in the U.S. we have the separation of church and state, and there are laws
Hmm.
governing psychedelics, and so it starts to get very weird if you're saying this is a path to God, make it legal. It then becomes part of the protection of freedom of religion versus our kind of capitalistic society that wants to cash in on these powerful substances that do have very um, positive effects for people kind of in this worldly way. I think in general, Americans are uncomfortable, or well, one, I think it's human to create dualities. Two, I think Americans in particular are still uncomfortable with mystical states in the sense of like being something that is available, this that may be desirable, that there are many paths to those states, but you can have them now. Versus, we're still a Christian country. God is someone you experience after death. So I think there are all these forces at play that make it still a little bit uncomfortable to talk about how to know God in a way that's here and now. That you can have that. Um, and I think with yoga, I think because it's so familiar, it's almost like it's so ordinary now. How could that get me to this, you know, Satchidananda? How could I experience a bliss state? Wait, I just go to the Y and I do yoga. So I think it almost has a different burden now to convince people that it can be extraordinary versus psychedelics, which are still not legal in most places and,
Maybe that's part of it, isn't it? I mean,
have
we
a
talked
different
before.
storytelling around them.
Yeah. We talked before, like we started about the yoga mum, and that's, I think, a specific term in the US, but I'm sure it's probably
Yeah,
come over to Britain as well. Everyone knows what it is anyway. And it's the most kind of socially conformative, kind of conventional, really, right? Like a yoga, I guess it's a pejorative term in some respects, but, it's a term of a
yeah,
conformism,
cliche.
really.
Yeah,
It's a cliche. It's a
yeah,
conformist. It's someone who's a regular society person, right? Like who fits into the
yeah,
boxes and is acting accordingly to what's expected upon them. And I think
yeah.
maybe that's. I mean, would you think? And we're just kind of trying to kind of think of a way to wrap up and conclude our chat. Do you think the next turn of the wheel is for yoga to shed that again and become something radical? Because I mean, just thinking in the most practical terms about the whole yoga Ashtanga going to Mysore thing, right? And now it's so easy to go to Mysore, right? And everyone's going
Yeah,
and get and it's not mystical anymore. So there's no kind of
right.
effort, right? And so in
Yeah.
some respects, that whole spiritual journey of doing something which is kind of uncertain, hard, which does demand you to be different and to put your hand up and say, well, I'm doing something rather different here that my parents might not approve of and society
Hmm.
might think well of. Do you think that needs to happen to yoga again, or do you think that will happen to yoga again?
So it's interesting. It's a good question. Like, you're right. We're kind of set for another turn of the wheel. And if psychedelics become legal more widely, you could imagine another version of the kind of late 60s, early 70s, where people have this experience of God consciousness, but they really want to find a different way of activating that. They don't want to draw past it all the time. So you could imagine it being the kind of a kind of ancillary to the kind of popular or repopularization of psychedelics. But the world feels so flat right now that it doesn't feel like, and this is because of the internet and the accessibility of everything everywhere all the time. It's hard to imagine it having the charge of like, I'm doing something really different, except in some place in the US, books are banned. Many books are banned about many things that seemed completely uncontroversial even 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I can imagine in pockets of the US that kind of regaining some of the like revolutionary charge, um, where it's hard to get certain information or harder to get certain information, and where a version of life is being kind of in a very authoritarian way being presented. Um, yeah, we'll see. I mean, I also think what we're facing is a huge amount of uncertainty coming up with climate catastrophe and what my kids are going to experience, and how do these traditions speak to them or not when they may speak very strongly to them because there's a quality of inner peace amidst whatever is happening, or they may find them insufficient as they are trying to address all sorts of really practical, like, where do you live that's safe? Are we dealing with a real,
Yeah.
actual, it's no longer resisting
Armageddon. Yeah,
consumerism,
yeah.
right? It's like surviving on the apocalypse. So that's a dramatic ending, but it's hard to know. I think we'll have our answer in about 10 years, Adam.
You
I think
reckon?
we will.
When else move to places that can't be flooded or burnt or
Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know. I think I kind of feel like yoga has to separate itself for now from the physical gymnastics aspects again to reclaim some kind of sense of integrity or a kind of validity in people's eyes, right? I think it's been too. I mean, I hate to say it, but I think it's been too mixed in with selling people, cosmetically now that. To regain some kind of credence to those people
Yeah.
that are really looking, it probably and all the stuff with yoga injuries now, like yoga is there's
Yeah.
since I think I can't remember the famous article in the New York Times. I can't remember the guy who wrote that article now.
Oh,
Since
yeah,
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 yeah. I remember that one. Yeah.
since that point, there's this whole yoga injures you, and now there's this whole hypermobility thing. Like yoga, you don't want to stretch. Stretching's dangerous, So
Yeah.
I kind of feel like its future lies within how it's defined in a physical sense, perhaps, in terms
Yeah.
of moving forward to the next turn of the wheel. I mean, also with the psychedelics thing, I would just kind of say that, remember, in your book, you say that Leary, actually, I didn't realize this, he kind of splits, he has this psychedelic thing, and then he kind of realizes he can't, pop at it every day, that he has to, has to do something to kind of have that on an experience without drugs, right? So
Yeah. Oh,
I
that was
think
Ram Dass. Leary
oh,
went to the
Leary,
grave on
did
acid.
he?
Yeah.
Oh, did he?
Yeah. But Ram Dass did. And yeah.
Right.
And so, yes, I think you're right. I think it has, to regain the possibility of yoga as a path to God consciousness or divine or transcendence. It will have to somehow relate differently to this very this notion of yoga as exercise, and that which is the common notion. And psychedelics may or may not be part of how that happens. It's going to be interesting, and it may be that it's even referred to something as something like yoga might not even be in the branding, right? Even though you and I would know, oh, that's yoga. Like, it may be a teacher comes along who calls their movement something else, in the way that uh, someone like Yogi Bhajan called his movement healthy, happy, holy, the three HO or whatever. So we shall see. It'll be interesting, though. There is room for it. There is room for another turn.
Well, I think whether we like it or not, it will turn again, and yeah,
Yes,
and how, yeah,
yes,
and hopefully we'll be meeting up in a number of years to discuss the next phase. Are
yes.
you gonna? Do you plan on writing any more? Would you write another chapter or write another book? What are you working on these days?
So I have a feeling I'll write another book. I don't. It'll
Yeah,
be probably quite different. I don't know that I mean, that book required so much research. I was in,
totally.
archives and libraries, and I don't know that I'll do that kind of book again, but I do think I'll write at least another book, maybe more than another book. And I think the themes that uh, yoga addresses and that I was addressing through other people and through the history of yoga are still very near and dear to my heart, like how to live, how to experience the divine in this life. I still find those really interesting questions to ask and try to answer. Um, and so, and then in the other part of my life, I work with startups as an advisor. So I've been in the business of helping normalize new technology, whether those are spiritual technologies or actual digital technologies.
I was going to ask you what just to bring it down to a practical level, what you're doing now, because I know you're not in academia, are you? And you've got two children, you said.
I have two teenagers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do they
Yeah.
practice yoga?
Uh, a little bit, my 16-year-old will do some sun salutations. I bet when they're a little older, they will. And I feel like, I still practice a little. It's challenging right now given everything going on, but I can see a day where that's reintegrated a little bit more even than now uh,
In your life?
in my life, and maybe theirs
Yeah.
too,
Right. Yeah.
because those movements, I mean, I will leave them to their own spiritual paths and journeys,
Mm.
but I do think, they're they certainly my 16-year-old understands how those movements really help him, He's an athlete. He's a soccer player, so, or a football player, you would say, and so could use some of that different kind of
Football's
movement.
becoming popular, is it? There, soccer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, is it? Is it?
yeah,
Huh, that's
yeah.
funny. What does I
Americans
mean?
figured it
What?
out.
Right. At last, you don't have to dress up in massive pads and
Yeah.
jump at each other anymore. So, what does he? Just to finish off, what does he take it? What does he think of yoga? He's not looking for God, so he's just literally looking at it in a physical perspective, is he? And what's
Well,
Generation Z or whatever they call these days
yeah.
looking? How are they looking at it?
So the thing about Phoenix, who's my 16-year-old, so his dad is studied Tibetan Buddhism and is like a hardcore
Right.
Buddhist,
Okay.
and sort of also kind of the integration of psychedelics and Buddhism. So he has a lot of baggage around this stuff, for good or bad. Like, but he hasn't rebelled, so he will read Watts and loves Alan Watts. He hasn't read Autobiography of a Yogi yet, but he may. So for him, however, he's not deeply engaged in that. I mean, he's figuring out where he wants to go to college. So, but he understands yoga is part of this bigger complex of ideas, and it is a spiritual technology, even though he might only do sun salutations to stretch his calves. So, but he understands that there is this huge universe that he could tap into were he interested. And I think he'll end up, spending some time in India. He's a very adventuresome kid, so I do think he has that in him.
I guess he's not like the kind of benchmark of a regular child.
No,
Then, if he's got a
no,
father, we can't take him
yeah,
as a general example.
no,
But
you can't.
nevertheless, it does raise a point that obviously everything is out there now for everyone, and you don't
Yes,
have to search very far to find Alan Watts. I mean, like you could
yep,
find him just like scrolling through YouTube. You could find one of his
yes,
little recorded talks. So the technology is endemic, and the messages as well. It's just how to make it esoteric again, like in a
right.
way,
In a way, in a
yeah,
way,
how to make it special and how to make it like secret again, because it is so like we spent ages before starting this podcast, well, little time anyway, me and Stefanie, trying to figure out a way in here to what we're going to talk about, because it's too close. I mean, it's like closer than your nose. You can't even see yoga anymore. It's just
yeah.
become so ingrained in the matrix.
Yeah, 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 and it's interesting too whether it needs that. I mean, we feel like part of the joy of yoga was the feeling of discovery. Now, it may still it's interesting. It may still have that, retain more of that than we think, because you could get kind of the superficial hit, but you still have to invest into really, really unlock the practice and understand it. It still requires effort or attention and looking. Um, so in a way, there's so much information about everything available all the time. There's still the discovery, because even though it's all available, there's so much of it, right? So that might be where someone like Phoenix, it's superficially available, but it still requires that effort to really understand it
Mm,
deeply.
mm,
And yeah, so it'll be interesting to see. I I I
mm.
I think some people will come to it in a profound way. I think that's always going to be the case. And I think they still will feel like it's a discovery, because they haven't internalized this information. We have, but they haven't.
And also, I suppose, how it's held with or without in terms of against society, isn't it? Because when I started it was still something which was somewhat niche, somewhat kind of rebellious, even to do,
Yeah.
to pursue something in terms of an everyday practice. Certainly, was somewhat weird to people, right? You do this every day, they
Yes.
would always say,
Yeah.
right? Every day, like
Yeah. Yeah.
so it was. I don't think I would have gotten into it now. Let's say, but it was something which it was a statement. I'm going to do this thing every day, and
Yeah. Yeah.
and it was very much against modern capitalism and against the kind of
Yes.
the kind of status quo, right? And so it was a definition that I think I took upon myself, more than the kind of technology of self enlightenment or whatever we want to. We've been talking about a little bit more of a kind of social statement, which it'd be interesting to see how that bears out in the future, right? Because
Yes.
currently
Yes.
doing yoga is a social statement of conformism. It's quite the opposite.
Yes. I think that is true, but I think anything that requires true dedication and that has that quality of ritual, and that might complicate a routine that is more normal, I
Right.
think still could retain some of that. We're kind of a little bit outside the norm, but it's, they're not even going into work anymore in the US. Like people are still working remotely. So even understanding something as a ritual that you have to build your life around rather than that something that might even make certain jobs hard. Like I couldn't have been an investment banker practicing
Yeah.
Ashtanga
Yeah.
almost every morning. And there were a few, but uh, even that's different. So it's hard to understand how if people will see it as an antidote to modern post-industrial capitalism or not. But I even think that's so hard to predict how that's going to shift in our coming worlds. It's,
Yeah.
there's a lot. The straight line version of what we're living now is, I don't think, exists anymore.
All right. Well, let's see where we end up in a few years, everyone. And just remains to say thank you very much, Stephanie. I mean, we could carry on. I'm going to have more and more questions coming now. But anyways, we'll leave it there. And thanks, Stephanie, very much. And read the book. It's a great book, Subtle Body, Origins of Yoga in America. Excellent book, and also really interesting to compare Stephanie, say, to another guest, Suzanne Newcomb, who talks about yoga in the UK and how it had a slightly different trajectory in the UK. So read both books. Suzanne's written an excellent book as well. Anyway, Stephanie, thank you very much for coming. It's been really like such a nice chat today I've had. So thanks again
Thank
for
you so
coming
much. It was
and
really
chatting.
fun.